All right, welcome everybody to today's session, which is about preparing over the next couple of weeks for your maths or stats exam here at UWA, and a few tips for what you might be able to do during the exam itself. Just got a gratuitous plug up there for some of the other services that I can provide for you, and you'll be getting a copy of this when you receive your version of the presentation slides, and all those links are things you can click and follow up. Now, just to give you a flavour of what's going to happen over the next 45 minutes or so, this is the plan I've got. Obviously, we've been going for about 11 weeks now during the semester, and there's a couple of weeks to go along with a pre-exam study period. And I've broken the workshop up into sections based on that range of time, as well as a few tips about what might happen on exam day itself. There are a few appendices you can see there. I've got information relating to a number of different units, particularly first year maths and stats units, and some of that information is specific to those subjects, so you may find that useful. What I might do though is just get a sense, now that I've got quite a decent crowd forming, I might get a sense of where you guys are coming from, because it'll help me develop the session according to the needs of my audience. So I'm just going to launch a little poll here. So what you should see on your screen at the moment is just a list of common units, which you may or may not be doing. You may be doing more than one of these, or you may be doing other units altogether. Just so I know who's who in the zoo, as it were. Be interesting to know where people are coming from. Oh yes, lots of votes coming in there. Excellent, give that a minute or so and then I'll show you what we've got. So it looks like most of you have had a crack at that. Yeah, this is just handy for me. I'll just end the polling there and share the results. So it looks like a lot of people have come from the Maths Fundamentals unit, which is handy. I've got some good stuff for you. The Stat 1520 and Stat 1400, a lot of what appears in this workshop relates to Stat 1520, which is the economics and business version of Intro Stats, but pretty much all of it will apply to the Stat 1400 students as well. And a lot of it would be relevant for anyone doing the management unit at the bottom, but nobody voted for that one. Okay, thank you very much. That helps me a lot. Let's get our screen back again. Okay, so let's get stuck in. The first thing I would say is that there isn't really one true path to success in exams. It's very much an individual journey that you're on. Plus, you've already, most of you, been on part of that journey already. You've been quite good at sitting exams successfully on previous occasions, probably in year 12 or something like that recently. Obviously, you don't abandon the strategies that you've got that you know are good for you and work. What we're doing at the moment is looking at how we adapt those strategies to our new environment, which is studying at university level. So you may want to adapt or change the way you do things a bit in light of that. What I'm hoping is that today some of the tips and ideas which have come from my experience working with students and sometimes my own experience as a student, you may find something there that you can add to your own collection of strategies going forward. The other element that is occupying everybody's thoughts at the moment is this notion of online exams. Excuse me. Most of us, including the staff, have not engaged with this style of exam before. So hopefully we can all get through it together. What's important about a new system like this is that you know the technical details of how it's going to work. A lot of exams, I notice, are going to be run using the Exemplify software, which is something you have to download, set up and test on your computer. So make sure you've done that. Some exams are being done through the Learning Management System, LMS, and there are even a few exams that will take place in the old-fashioned way of sitting in a large room, writing at a small desk. You may have a combination of all three of those things. So make sure you know how they're going to work, particularly what are the rules around how you conduct yourself during these different types of exams. And the best way to do that is a couple of really excellent web pages that have been developed over the last few weeks, available through the UWA students website. Couple of clickable links there. Support for the online exams, how do you get set up, and what sort of things should you be doing before and during the exams. So lots of really great general information there that should answer most of your questions about the process you're about to go through. The other thing, of course, is to know about the unit-specific instructions that your coordinator will apply to your particular exam. So typically, and this goes for all types of exams, it's really important to know which of the topics they've covered have been are listed to be examinable, because every now and then they talk about a topic, but they're not interested in testing that during exam. So it's important to know what you need to study for. Especially with these online exams, a lot of them are going to be what we call open book, and it's really useful to know whether or not your exam is one of them. And along the same lines, you also need to know whether the exam is going to consist of multiple choice questions, or you're going to be asked to upload written answers to your questions. And sometimes an exam will contain both types of answer. Also, what sort of information will be provided with your exam paper, such as a formula sheet or set of statistical tables, perhaps, if you're doing a stats unit. Find out whether you're going to get one and what it looks like. And coordinators are usually fairly chatty about other tips and general advice that will apply to their particular exam. You may also be aware that a lot of information is published about your unit at the start in the learning management system, but the circumstances in which we've been working have changed during the semester quite dramatically, as you know, and obviously there will probably be updated versions of the way the unit will be assessed. So make sure you check the LMS again over the next few days. Some exams, some coordinators haven't put up this information yet, but in the next few days they should, and you need to check to make sure you've got everything that's up to date. So let's talk a bit in general about what I call the keys to success, and there are three of these when it comes to studying maths or stats. One I've dubbed the big picture. Now, what I mean by that is have some idea about how your unit is constructed, how the topics connect to each other, and the order in which they've been taught. And that's really useful because sometimes you find that the topics you did in, say, week 1 or week 2, week 3 are tools that are used to understand later topics. So there's a connection between them. Some of the earlier topics may actually have been simplified versions of topics they expand on later. So you may find towards the end of semester that when you're working on a general topic, that actually the things you learned earlier in the semester have already been subsumed into that topic and you don't need to learn them separately. So topics can form like a thread of connected ideas, and you may find that other parts of the unit involve another separate thread of ideas. And this kind of makes different topics potentially little subunits within your own unit, and you can study them in blocks separately from each other. That's a really handy way to shift your focus while you're studying. The second element is where most of us start. It's certainly the way I started when I was a first-year student, what I call the small picture, which is about solving practice problems, the sort of weekly exercises you've been getting, the kind of problems you've been asked to do, and exercises that help you understand the material. One of the key points I like to make at this stage is it's really important to engage with those exercises. Write things down, make notes, put pen to paper, and try and solve problems. It's a much better way of learning than simply re-watching your lecture videos, reading your notes. You get a certain comfort in watching an expert talk about a problem, but you only really know that you understand something if you can write it out for yourself. So don't be sucked into watching too many lecture videos over and over again. The third key to success is knowing what to expect when you get into the exam room. Now, the reason for this is that the exercises you get during the semester are designed for a different purpose to the ones you get in the exam, even though they're about the same topic. So, for example, exam questions, their job is to find out what you know about a topic as quickly as possible, which is very different to the exercises you've had so far, which are designed to help you learn the material over a longer period of time. So it's really useful to not be surprised by the style of the exam question when you actually get into the exam room. And obviously practicing past exam questions or questions from practice papers is an excellent way to achieve that. So, got a little running head along there. First 11 weeks of the semester are marked in green because that's pretty much what's already happened. And what's happened over the last 11 weeks is obviously an important part of preparing for exams. And all you need to have done so far is engaged with the content, done the tests, done the assignment questions and practice problems. And it doesn't matter if you found that a difficult process. If you didn't get great marks or you struggled with some of that, that's not an issue. You've engaged with the content, you're part of the way to getting ready for an exam. And that's really important because maths is very connected, as I said, and it's very difficult to learn a lot of mathematics in a short period of time for that reason. And that is a bit different to some of the other units you might be doing, where immersing yourself into a topic to write an essay, for example, is obviously the best way to go. Whereas in maths, it's better to do it incrementally, a bit each week, so that you can learn the early topics that feed into the later ones. So if you're in the situation, as often we are at this stage of semester, where there's a few topics that you haven't looked at yet, maybe a whole week's worth of lectures that you haven't got to yet, week 11, week 12 is a really good time to do that because things are winding down a little bit, especially in week 12. You often find that units don't add new material in the final week of teaching, and you have that opportunity to engage with the spade work on some topics you haven't done yet. So let's talk about week 12, next week. This is a chance to get yourself organised and ready for the next couple of weeks. A good trawl through the LMS site for your unit is a good start because you may find there are pockets of information that you haven't been able to get hold of yet. So at the moment, I notice lecturers are putting up lots of extra videos explaining things in various parts of their LMS site. Particularly look out in the announcements for information about what's going to happen in the exams. That'll start to come online fairly soon, if it hasn't already. Very few introductory maths and stats units use the course materials online feature of the library website, but every now and then they will pop a few goodies in there. I would just go to the One Search feature of the library, which you've probably used before, and select the course materials online option, and you should be able to see if there's anything there. You'll probably have a mixture of hard copy resources. Perhaps you've bought a copy of the unit reader, or you've printed out some lecture slides and written on them, and you've obviously got your handwritten exercises from during the semester. Always a good idea to organise that in such a way that you can find everything related to a topic nice and fast. If you have the option of putting lecture notes together with the exercises and solutions for a topic, that's a great way to find things quickly. I find sometimes with unit readers that it can be tricky to locate information in a hard copy. I used to get into the habit of putting little post-it notes at the edge of the start of each chapter in a hard copy book or a textbook, and that way you can very quickly find information on a particular subject. If you are using some of the PDF files, such as a PDF version of a unit reader, the find function in your PDF reader is an excellent way to track things down. If you're on a PC, I use Control F. If you're on a Mac, it's Command F, and type in a keyword, derivative, radians, whatever it is that is a technical term you need to track down, and it'll take you straight to the relevant page. So we talked a bit about the big picture. How do you get a big picture overview, get a drone up ahead of all the content you've looked at and see how it fits together? Well, one of the main ways to do that is to scan over fairly quickly the main points and chapter headings of the lecture notes, starting at the beginning of the course. And a good strategy at this point is to establish what you might call a summary notebook, or even just a great big piece of paper. And you can write notes about each topic, the key features of those. So we're talking about the main theory, any formulas, key definitions that were introduced. And always useful to leave more space, because this is going to be an active document as your revision unfolds. We're not worrying yet about the small picture, the examples and exercises, just getting an overview. And we're looking, as I said, for those connections and threads about related topics. Now, a really excellent way to do this is what I call a topic map. You don't have to spend forever doing this. And I've put together 3 partial topic maps for 3 typical units that you might be interested in: Stat 1520, Math 1011, and Math 1720. And it looked like Math 1720 was the winner in the poll. So I'm just going to run through quickly how that one's structured. It's quite useful for people doing other units, because I want to show you how they're put together, and this is a good one to do it with. So I'll show you what I mean. If you are doing Math 1720, the first thing you would have noticed is you've got a chapter about numbers, fractions, and the order of operations. So what I would do is get a very large piece of paper and a pencil, because you're going to make mistakes and you're going to need to move things around. So we write that on the left. And what you found in chapter 2 was that the things you do with numbers and fractions translate into algebra, where numbers are replaced by letters. So there's a connection between those 2 topics. You then did some work on solving equations involving algebraic symbols. And in the following chapter, looked at simultaneous equations, 2 equations at a time. Now, the interesting thing here is that at this point, you didn't just carry on moving on from the simultaneous equations section. You went back to algebra and looked at more features of algebraic manipulation, expanding and factorising brackets. So that's now part of the original thread. Quadratic expressions turned up at this point. And then over the next few weeks, we introduced more elements of algebra: indices, logarithms, and a couple more places where solving equations turned up. So I've just added a couple more bits there. And the important thing here is to pick up the threads. By this stage, you notice that at various points during the semester, you have spent time solving equations. And what's happened is the equations have become more sophisticated. They've developed more elements. They've developed indices, they've developed logs and exponentials. And what you now have, by the time you get to about week 8 or week 9, is a whole suite of techniques designed to help you solve equations. Anything from the ones you did back in chapter 2 right through to later ones. And the other major thread that runs through Math 1720 is the development of an algebra toolkit. Happens at various points during the semester when you're ready for it, and that blue box there encompasses all those ideas. So we know how topics link together. So if you're going to do something on, say, chapter 6, solve equations with indices, it's useful to know something about all the topics that led up to that. Occasionally there is a specific application of the theory, and Maths 1011 has a few of these as well, which are essentially the end of the sequence. They sit alone. And then, as we said, we've got these major threads, which you can study to some extent in isolation from each other. So now it's time for the small picture. Let's look at some problems. Now, we're mostly at the revision stage of the process. You've run through all these problems and exercises in previous weeks and done your best to get on top of understanding them. So if you think you're pretty good at something already, I know how to take a derivative, for example, if you're doing a calculus course, why not go straight to a previous exam question and see if you really are up to speed? Try doing that first. If you do well on that, that's great. That tells you you don't have to revise that as much as maybe some other topics. If you get stuck, well, there are things you can do. You could revise the exercises that went with that topic so that you remind yourself what's going on. And at this stage, it's not necessary really to do all the practice exercises again. Typically, a problem set will consist of maybe 10 questions, starting with an easy one, going through to medium difficulty to more challenging ones. Why not warm up with an easy problem, go to do question 5 or question 6, and then maybe one of the hard ones. That way you can speed up the revision. You always have the lecture videos and the notes you took when you watched those videos, and you can jump back to sections of the lecture videos if you really need to drill into something and understand it better. And you should find that if you've had a go at something, tried a few exercises relating to that topic, that watching the lecture again will make the lights go on much better than they did the first time, because you've got a better grasp. At this point in semester, you also have all the solutions available to the previous exercise sheets, and it is very tempting when you're in a hurry to look straight at the answers for a clue as soon as you get stuck. Now, it's actually a good idea to try and resist that urge for a few minutes at least. See if you can rack your brains for an answer, or think of your way around the problem, what we call lateral thinking. That's a good way to make you learn how to think on your feet, because every now and then you might get a bit stuck in an exam and you'll have to do that quite quickly. So if you're practicing now at little memory tricks for remembering things, they're going to help you later on as well. But don't bang your head against a brick wall forever. If you get bogged down for a couple of minutes, obviously have a quick peek at the solutions and see if you can move on. But yeah, just avoid that temptation to do it straight away. Sometimes, despite your best efforts, you may find that you're going to need some advice. By all means, park that topic for a while, and we'll talk about how you get help a bit later on. And you can always move on to another thread, another subtopic, or even another unit altogether, and refresh your brain that way. I mentioned that summary book, or at least a summary sheet that you develop as you revise. Every time the light bulb goes on with something you didn't understand before, it's a great idea to write it down. Excellent way to commit things to memory is by actually writing it down. And you'll have it in the summary book if you forget. I would always do my revision with any resources I know I will have access to in the exam, such as a formula sheet or the stats tables that you will be using in the exam. If it's an open book exam, you can start to develop your strategies for managing all your notes. Keep doing that so that you're ready to go on exam day. Sometimes there's a temptation to simply rely on doing all your revision from past exam papers. They're not the best way to understand the content. Generally, you can't cover every aspect of a topic in an exam question, so even the ones you've got access to may not cover everything that might be tested on the day. And people who set exams are pretty good at designing them so that if you know what you're doing, you'll be able to demonstrate that. And they change the questions in subtle ways so that if you just try to memorize last year's exam answers, it won't go so well. So those old practice problems that you've done during the semester are still valuable. You may find that some exams won't come with solutions. I'm finding more and more that lecturers do provide solutions to past exam papers, but there used to be a policy of not doing it. So you may find some of the old papers you find in the library, for instance, may not have a good set of answers that go with them. Always a good idea to roll over topics more than once. There's an old saying about going 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It can be a little bit disconcerting to think you're on top of something and then come back 2 days later and realise you've forgotten half of it. But the act of going over it again is an excellent way to eventually make all that stuff stick. And if you run out of practice problems, your lecture examples and unit outlines are full of them. So your lecturers went through certain examples during the lectures. Why not stop the video at that point or cover up an answer and try doing that question for yourself? So plenty of spare exercises available. Another good idea is to give yourself a practice run. It's all very well to be able to answer exam questions when there's no time pressure, and you can use all sorts of resources that you may not have access to on the day. So it's always a good idea when you're pretty close to the exam to quarantine a past or practice paper and see if you can do it under exam conditions. This is an excellent way to sort out a number of things. Do you really know what you're doing? Can you answer questions at reasonable speed? And can you avoid making too many of what I call silly mistakes, the sort of mistakes that you wouldn't make if you weren't under pressure? So the more you can practice that, the better. Another thing that I find is important, and I emphasise this in the sections where I talk specifically about stats units, but it also applies to a lot of other units. When you're studying topics during the semester, you know that in week 9 you're doing t-tests or you're doing techniques of integration. You don't have to choose the methods that you're applying to a particular problem because you know this week is all about that topic. Of course, when you get to an exam, all those topics from the whole semester are sitting on the page, not always in the same order in which they were taught. So you have to be good at picking up the keywords that alert you to what technique needs to be applied, which part of the course is in play here. Particularly important for the stats students because you learn a lot of different hypothesis tests, and it's important to know which test to apply from a scenario that they provide to you. You have to learn how to make those choices. And there's more details about that in the appendix when you get your copy of this. Another important point about the study break, which happens after all your classes, all your online classes in this case finish. Suddenly you have a blank sheet. You don't have any timetable, your time is your own and you have to organise it for yourself. So it's a good idea to put some structure in place before you start. Don't do something that you can't achieve. So for instance, don't just say, right, I'm going to spend 4 hours studying without a break. That's not going to work. No one can do that. What you can do is play to your strengths. You do know that you can concentrate more or less for 45 minutes at a time because that's how long a typical UWA class lasts. So why don't you break your study up into smaller chunks? Also play to your strengths in terms of when you're at your best. Are you a morning person, afternoon, evening person? Try and do your study when you're at your best. So just as an example, this is what I used to do when I was a first year student, and it worked pretty well. So I did it for most of my study life. I tried to get in 8 hours of studying a day, and I would start in the morning, finish in the early evening, so I had the evening off. And I broke it up into 4 2-hour blocks. But I didn't study for 2 hours at a time. I studied for 55 minutes, which was just 5 minutes longer than my lectures, and I took a 10-minute break after the first 55 minutes. Made a cup of tea, had a walk around. I would change the unit. I was doing 4 units, so I would do maths for the first one and then maybe biology for the next one, just to get some refreshment there for the brain. Half an hour break between the blocks in the morning and an hour off for lunch. Now, as you can see from that, I didn't have any other commitments in my life. I wasn't wrangling a job or children at the time. You, of course, may have those commitments to worry about, and also family commitments of other kinds. Just try and work it around as best you can. And be flexible. I sketched out a plan for how much time I would spend on each unit, but after the first couple of days of the study break, I realised I was much better at something than I thought, much worse at something else than I thought, and I could make adjustments to study the more difficult topics later. Okay, little plug for our website there. I won't go too much into the concentration. You can read that yourself. The only thing I would advise you to do at this stressful time of year is try and make sure that you keep eating properly and you sleep properly. Those of you who've had big assignments during the semester or had to write essays, I'm sure you've had the experience of pulling an all-nighter or staying up very late to finish something. That's great, as long as you remember that you're able to sleep in the next day because you can barely remember your own name. It's no good staying up all night just before an exam because you won't have the brain power to actually do the exam. So a few quick words about what to do to get help, because your classes are finished, your access to the tutors and lecturers is a bit different. But they will be trying their best to make themselves available leading up to the exam. They'll probably have consulting times done through Zoom, like this particular workshop. They may have set up discussion boards in their LMS unit so that you can talk to other students. Find out when they are, put them into your timetable so that you use them. I'll be doing what we call online consultations, so a one-on-one meeting using video and screen sharing and so on. And if you look at the start of the slides, there's a link to how you access that. Another good tip, get together with other people in your unit and have a study session, group study session. This is an excellent way to firstly pool your ideas with other people. They may know something about a topic that will help you and vice versa. But more importantly, even when you're explaining information to another person, another student, you learn more about that topic yourself. I call this the tutor effect. It's something I noticed when I shifted from being a student to being a tutor in universities. I learned a lot more about content because I was explaining it to other people. So it's a good two-way street, that one. These days, of course, you're either going to have to find yourself a cafe and sit 1.5 metres apart from each other, or you could organise an online session through Skype or Zoom. Which brings us finally to the exam itself. Time starts, you're sitting down with the exam paper in front of you. And one thing I always recommend with the start of an exam is to spend a little bit of time making a plan, what I call triage. It used to be compulsory when I was a student, and we were all sitting in a big room together, that you could look at your exam paper for the first 10 minutes of the exam, but you weren't allowed to write anything. It used to drive people nuts. But there was a benefit to that. Even if you spend just a couple of minutes making a bird's eye view of the exam and then putting pen to paper. So the crucial thing about this in my book is decide which order you're going to answer the questions in. You don't have to answer them in the order they appear on the paper. You will know when you get into the exam which topics from that unit you're good at, which ones you're not so good at, and which ones are a real problem. I would put them in order from the ones you're most confident about down to the ones you're least confident about, and answer them in that order. Often maths and stats questions are quite large and they have multiple parts. So you might have question 1, A, B, C, D, E, and then question 2, A, B, C, D, E. I'm recommending that you might decide to do all of question 2 before you do question 1. Pretty important because the subparts of a question are usually linked to each other and you can't jump from one to the other. If you do that, it's a good way to build up your confidence at the start of the exam, get all the marks for easy, inverted commas, questions, and get yourself ready for the harder ones later. And if you do find yourself running out of time, the questions that are left to the end are the ones that you probably weren't going to score very well on anyway. Perhaps get a highlighter pen and highlight technical words if you've got a physical copy of the paper, and give yourself a bit of a time limit on how long you're going to spend on each question. Usually each question comes with a number of marks available for that question, and some of them will vary. So if a question's worth 10 marks versus a question versus 20, you know there's more meat, there's more work to do in the 20-mark question. Exams are very carefully designed, very carefully worded, so that you are able to answer exactly provide answers in exactly the way that they've got marks allocated for. So look for any kind of relevant information. What technique do I have to apply here? What clues have they given me? What information am I feeding into my t-test or whatever? And at this point, of course, you could find yourself having to write out your answers or look at multiple choice as providing the answers. I'll talk about both of those separately, starting with those of you who have to submit actual written answers somehow. Again, the wording of exam questions is really specific. They will want answers to particular things and only those things. Very easy to get into a situation where you know you could do something with a particular situation and you go ahead and do it even though the exam hasn't asked for it. So sometimes you get a word problem and they say, interpret this word problem as a set of simultaneous equations, do not solve the equations. Every now and then there'll always be somebody who sets up the equation and then spends half a page solving them, even though they were specifically told not to. Don't get any marks for that. With written exams, there are often some really good keywords to watch out for. Write down is a good one. Write down the answer to this. That's a clue that you shouldn't have to do any workings to achieve that. It's a question of if you understand the question being asked, you should be able to answer it in one line. Deduce or hence, these are words that appear usually later in a question. Deduce means develop an argument from a previous part of the question. So you must use that result. Sometimes they'll say hence or otherwise. Yes, you could do it from the previous part, but there are other ways to do it which are just as acceptable, and you can use those as well. Those of you in, say, Math 1011, which is a university level mathematics unit, you might find that you're asked to do little proofs, what we call proofs. Show that so-and-so is always equal to so-and-so. Verify is a good one. If you're doing any kind of unit that involves, say, differential equations, they may say, verify that this function is a solution to this differential equation. That doesn't mean solve the differential equation. It just means stick the answer back into it and see if it works. 2 lines of work instead of 5. I always put this one in, explain. Sometimes there's a tendency with very algebra-heavy maths or stats courses to think that all the answers are algebraic, that you just have to write them as algebra. You don't use words. You're perfectly welcome to explain what you're doing using phrases or sentences. Anything you can do to help the markers understand what you're doing is important, especially if they say explain your answer. Better write it down. I'll give that one a miss. That doesn't affect many people. As I say, don't be afraid to use words. The more you help the markers, the better. Another thing to remember with written exams is nobody is giving you bonus marks for making the answers look pretty. You don't get any marks for presentation. The only thing that matters is that you write legibly enough for the poor marker to be able to read your handwriting. And I say that because there's nothing wrong with putting an ugly line through something you've made a mistake with and writing the answer underneath, or putting an arrow saying, follow me down here. That's all perfectly fine. Remember though that if you do cross out work, that's your indication to the markers that you believe what you've written is wrong. So they won't even look for marks under something that's been crossed out, even if it's correct. Just watch out for that. And another counterpoint to explaining what you're doing is, if you feel like writing something down, write it down, even if you think it betrays an appalling ignorance of the topic. Markers might have a little laugh at your expense, but they will not take marks off for doing that. You can't have marks deducted for saying very silly things. You'll just get naught. So you may as well write something down because it may actually be right. Another thing to remember about maths exams, written maths exams anyway, is you're not being marked on the final answer only. So if a question's worth 5 marks, it doesn't mean that you will get 0 if your answer is numerically or algebraically incorrect. They're looking to allocate 5 marks for 5 steps, 5 things that matter, that are skills used to answer the question. And if you get 3 of them right and then go wrong with the last 2, that's fine. You'll get maybe 3 out of 5 for that question. So partial marks are available for partially correct answers in written exams. Better than that, there's a thing called follow-through marking. So let's say you make a mistake with the 3rd step of a 5-step problem, but you do the remaining couple of steps correctly using that wrong information. You can still get full marks for those last couple of steps because they won't continue to punish you for making the mistake earlier. We call that follow-through marking. The final answer is wrong, but you may have only made one mistake, so you might still get 4 out of 5. Let's give that a miss. Yeah, sometimes you find that things aren't going as well as you expected, that when you've allocated 10 minutes for a question and you still haven't finished at the 10 or 11-minute mark, sometimes it's a good idea to just come back to it later if there's time. Sometimes the break in concentration on a question is enough to see where you were going wrong before or remember the next step. And even if you don't, at least you're moving on to another question where you can get marks. I've just noticed in the chat window somebody's asked about partial marking for multiple choice questions. I'll get to multiple choice in just a moment. I'm seeing more questions here, but I'll get to the multiple choice and see if that answers people's questions there. Another good thing over the course of 2 hours or however long your exam is, you do tend to spend a lot of time crunched over your keyboard or your piece of paper. What that tends to do is compress your lungs, and so it's a good idea every now and then, even if you're in a on-campus exam, just to sit up, put your shoulders back, maybe your hands behind your head, a few deep breaths, reinflates the lungs and the oxygen goes back to where you need it. So yes, we just got to the multiple choice exams. Now, there is a tendency for multiple choice exams, unfortunately, to be a last line marking exercise. You've got to pick the right answer, otherwise you don't get it right. So it is actually quite rare for there to be partial marking for multiple choice exam questions. Sometimes they are designed to allow a little bit of that, but you have to be a bit careful with multiple choice because they are designed to be, they're set up to be essentially get the answer right type questions or there's no marks. To compensate for that, they are often more bite-sized pieces of theory. So you don't have to do 8 or 9 lines of algebra usually to get a multiple choice question out, although sometimes that does happen. But they do try and get around that problem by making the questions more concentrated. And the important thing about maths multiple choice exam questions and stats is often you do need to do calculations to see whether you've got the right answer out of the options on the page. So just because a question is set up as multiple choice with some numbers to choose from at the end doesn't mean that you should be able to see it just by looking at it. Be prepared to scratch out workings. Obviously, you don't have to polish them up enough for an examiner to read them, just enough for you to get the right answer. So be prepared to do some writing. As I said, often a multiple choice question will be designed to test just one concept at a time. But sometimes, yes, they will involve a couple of concepts that you have to get right, both of them, to get the right answer. So just be prepared for some challenges there. Another counterpoint to the first thing I said there, basically don't try and second guess what the right answer should look like just by eyeballing the 4 or 5 options that you've got. If you know you're heading for an answer that's a number or an algebraic formula, try and calculate it yourself off to the side so that you get an answer that hopefully looks like one in the options. Sometimes we can get a bit clever with multiple choice answer options. Sometimes you'll get a option number 4, which answer is always, oh no, sorry, this is the previous point. Which answer is always true? This is one of those algebraic things. Sometimes you have an algebraic answer which may be true some of the time or a lot of the time, but if it's not always true, then it won't be the right answer. So that can be a little bit misleading. The one I was thinking of just before is the all of the above option. So you might be presented with 3 options followed by all of the above. And that can help you out sometimes, because if you're working through your understanding of the question and you think, well, answer A and answer C, I'm pretty sure are right, both right, then it's a good sign that the all of the above option is the correct one. You can also sometimes not answer a question completely, but you can at least rule out 1 or 2 options. If you're pretty sure they've got some answers in there that definitely aren't true, just put a cross through them, because when you get to the end of the exam, you might find that you just have to fill up the rest of the answers by guessing. Just check to make sure that that multiple choice exam is not one that actually does take marks off for incorrect answers. If you've got a free hand in guessing a few questions at the end that you didn't get done during the exam, at least you'll be able to improve your chances of getting it right by including guesses from just the remaining answer options. So if something has 4 options, you've ruled out 2 of them, then you've got a 50-50 chance of getting it right if you run out of time. I've seen knocking around the internet occasionally this notion that most people will put the correct answer in position B or C. They don't like putting them in A or D, the top or bottom of a list. Lecturers are awake to that. I certainly used to randomise the order of my answer options, so that doesn't work. Quick word about open book exams. Very tempting to think that this makes exams easier, but it doesn't always. If a lecturer knows they've got an open book exam, then they're not going to be testing you on your ability to remember things. They're going to test you on your ability to use those things and maybe interpret the results. And you're not going to have time in a short exam to read up on new material from your resources. So just treat it as a case of knowing as much as you can about topics beforehand, in the knowledge that if you really have to look something up, you should be able to do it, especially if you've indexed your notes very well. And if you do need to track down particular formulas or processes or definitions, making sure you've got all your pile of stuff next to you indexed properly is going to be important. So the final thing I'll say is it's always important to be confident in doing mathematics. So my advice is always to aim high. Aim to do really well. Because even if you don't achieve that standard, you generally do better than if you assume you're not going to do very well and achieve that level. And you may find as you've been going through your work, you do better than you think because of that connectedness between the content. You might think, I've forgotten everything from week 2 or week 3, and then get pleasantly surprised that you do understand it because you've been using it every week since then. So all it remains for me to do is wish all of you here this afternoon all the best with all the exams that you're doing. What I will do at this point is thank you all for coming and taking an hour out of your life to listen to me ramble on about this stuff. Make sure before you go that if you haven't already done so, just send me a private message with your student number in that message. I'm finding that Zoom doesn't always make it easy for me to track you down afterwards to send you the slides, because you'll be getting a copy of all of this information at the end. And once again, I draw your attention to the appendices down the back for specific units if you're in one of those units. And Appendix 6, since there aren't that many of them this time, is about on-campus exams. So if you are actually fronting up to the university to sit down in a room to write your exam, there's a few tips you might find useful for those kind of exams as well.